November 14, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Private First Class Takeshi Yamada of the Imperial Japanese Army's 38th Infantry Division crouched in a captured American foxhole, his hands trembling not from fear but from weakness. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. His unit, cut off from supply lines by American naval dominance, was subsisting on handfuls of rice and whatever they could forage from the jungle. Malaria and dysentery had reduced his body weight by 30 pounds in 2 months. His uniform hung on his frame like a scarecrow's clothes. When his squad overran this American position at dawn, they expected to find ammunition and weapons. What they found would fundamentally change Yamada's understanding of the war he was fighting. Scattered across the abandoned foxholes were dozens of small cardboard boxes, each about the size of a brick, labeled in English letters he couldn't read. U.S. Army Field Ration, his squad leader ordered them collected. Japanese intelligence wanted to analyze American field supplies. Yamada picked up one of the boxes. It was surprisingly heavy, perhaps 2 pounds. The cardboard was waxed, waterproof, sophisticated packaging. He tore it open with fingers that had lost their strength. What spilled out seemed impossible. A small tin of meat, hard biscuits wrapped in cellophane, a bar of chocolate, a packet of powdered coffee, 4 cigarettes in a waterproof wrapper, compressed sugar tablets, a stick of chewing gum, toilet paper, matches in a waterproof case, even a tiny can opener, and a wooden spoon. Yamada stared at these items spread on the muddy ground. This was a single meal for a common American soldier. 1 meal. It contained more food than he had eaten in a week. More importantly, it contained items he had not seen in months. Real coffee, not the burnt grain substitute issued to Japanese troops. Chocolate, a luxury that had disappeared from Japan before the war. Cigarettes, which Japanese soldiers received only sporadically. Toilet paper, which seemed an absurd luxury for combat conditions. He opened the meat tin with shaking hands. The smell hit him immediately. Real beef, processed and preserved, but unmistakably meat. He ate it cold, directly from the can, barely chewing. His stomach, shrunken from weeks of near starvation, cramped at the sudden richness. He ate the biscuits. They were hard, dense, flavorless compared to fresh bread, but to Yamada they tasted like the finest rice crackers. The chocolate bar had melted slightly in the tropical heat, but remained solid enough to break into pieces. The taste was overwhelming. Sweet, rich, decadent. A flavor his taste buds had almost forgotten existed. That night, in a diary he kept hidden from officers who might confiscate it, Yamada wrote an entry that would be recovered after his death 3 months later and translated by American intelligence. The translation remains in the National Archives. Today I ate what American soldiers discard when they retreat. It was more food than I have eaten in a week, meat that tasted like beef, chocolate that melted in my mouth. Real coffee, not the burnt grain we drink. Their soldiers carry cigarettes into battle. Cigarettes, as if war is an inconvenience rather than a struggle for survival. If this is what their common soldiers carry in their packs, what do their officers eat? What do their civilians eat? We have been told America is weak, desperate, on the verge of collapse. But a collapsing nation does not feed its soldiers like this. A desperate nation does not waste resources on chocolate and chewing gum for frontline troops. We are fighting a nation so rich they give their soldiers luxuries we cannot imagine. For the first time since I left Japan, I understand with certainty. We cannot win this war. What Private Yamada had discovered, what thousands of Japanese soldiers would discover in similar moments across the Pacific, was the staggering disparity between American and Japanese logistics capability. Not just in weapons or ships or planes, but in the most basic necessity of warfare: food. While Japanese soldiers were literally starving to death on jungle islands and remote outposts, American soldiers were complaining that their rations were boring and repetitive, while the Japanese high command ordered troops to achieve self-sufficiency, which meant foraging for anything edible. American quartermasters were shipping 60 million pounds of food monthly to forward areas and struggling to transport it fast enough to meet demand. The K-ration that Yamada found represented more than just a meal. It represented American industrial capacity applied to the problem of feeding armies in the field. It represented a nation wealthy enough to treat soldier comfort as a priority rather than a luxury. Most significantly, it represented a fundamental philosophical difference in how America and Japan approached warfare. Japan demanded soldiers endure hardship as proof of their warrior spirit. America eliminated hardship wherever possible because comfortable soldiers fought more effectively. Japan called American material focus weakness. America called Japanese deprivation stupidity. The outcome of the war would prove which philosophy worked better. Let me take you back to 1941 and show you how America revolutionized combat rations while Japan's soldiers slowly starved on victories their nation couldn't supply. In early 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before America entered the war, the U.S. Army recognized a critical problem. The existing field ration, called the C-ration, was too heavy and too bulky. Each C-ration weighed over 4 pounds and filled substantial space in a soldier's pack. For airborne troops who jumped with limited carrying capacity, the C-ration was impractical. The Army wanted something lighter, more compact, but still nutritionally complete. The task fell to Dr. Ansel Keys, a physiologist at the University of Minnesota who specialized in nutrition and metabolism. Keys would later become famous for his research on cardiovascular disease and the Mediterranean diet. But in 1941, he was simply a scientist being asked to solve an engineering problem. Create a complete daily ration that weighed less than 2 pounds, fit in a soldier's pocket, provided adequate nutrition for combat operations, remained edible after parachute drops, survived tropical heat and Arctic cold, and required no preparation or cooking. The specifications seemed nearly impossible. A soldier engaged in combat operations burns between 3,000 and 4,000 calories daily. Providing that much energy in less than 2 pounds of food required extremely calorie-dense components. The food had to remain edible for months or years in any climate. It had to provide not just calories, but complete nutrition, including proteins, fats, vitamins, and minerals. And it had to be palatable enough that soldiers would actually eat it, rather than discard it. Keys approached the problem systematically. He analyzed every possible food component for calorie density, nutritional value, durability, and transportability. He tested packaging materials for durability and waterproofing. He conducted field trials with soldiers carrying prototype rations through various conditions. Within 6 months, Keys had designed what he called the K-ration. The K supposedly stood for Keys, though the Army officially claimed it meant special or meal. Each K-ration was divided into 3 meals: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Each meal came in a small waxed cardboard box, waterproof and durable. The 3 boxes together weighed about 2¼ pounds and provided approximately 3,200 calories. But Keys understood something crucial that would distinguish American rations from every other nation's field food. Soldiers were not machines that simply needed fuel. They were human beings whose morale and mental state affected combat effectiveness. A soldier who ate monotonous, unpalatable food became demoralized. A soldier who received small luxuries felt valued and maintained fighting spirit. Therefore, each K-ration included items that had no nutritional purpose but significant psychological value. Cigarettes, chewing gum, candy. These weren't necessities. They were morale boosters, and Keyes argued successfully that morale was as important as calories. The breakfast ration contained a tin of chopped ham and eggs, a compressed cereal or fruit bar, 4 biscuits, a packet of soluble coffee, 3 sugar tablets, and 4 cigarettes. The dinner ration contained a tin of processed cheese or meat, 4 biscuits, 15 malted milk tablets, a packet of powdered lemon juice, sugar, and cigarettes. The supper ration contained a tin of meat product, biscuits, a 2-ounce chocolate bar, a packet of bouillon powder, sugar, and cigarettes. Every ration also included chewing gum, toilet paper, a wooden spoon, and waterproof matches. The production of K-rations began in May 1942. The scale of production would eventually dwarf anything Keyes had imagined. Between 1942 and 1945, American industry produced 105 million K-rations, 105 million complete 3-meal units. The logistics of producing these rations were staggering. Consider just the chocolate component. The Hershey Company received a contract to produce chocolate bars for K-rations, but normal chocolate melted in tropical heat, becoming inedible slush. Hershey's chemists developed a special formulation called the Ration D bar. This chocolate was designed to remain solid at temperatures up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. It was harder than normal chocolate, less sweet, and frankly not particularly pleasant to eat. Soldiers joked that it tasted like a chocolate-flavored candle. But it didn't melt. It provided concentrated calories, and it was psychologically comforting. Hershey produced this specialized military chocolate at a rate of 500,000 bars per day throughout the war. The coffee presented similar challenges. Fresh coffee was impossible to transport and prepare under field conditions. Instant coffee existed, but was expensive and considered inferior. Maxwell House developed a specialized soluble coffee for military use, improving the formula and scaling production to unprecedented levels. 260 million pounds of coffee were shipped to American forces during the war, much of it in K-ration form. Even the chewing gum was engineered. The Wrigley Company provided gum to K-rations not as candy, but as a functional tool. Chewing gum relieved stress, kept soldiers alert, reduced thirst sensations, and helped equalize ear pressure during altitude changes in aircraft. The military purchased essentially Wrigley's entire output for the duration of the war. Civilians in America couldn't buy Wrigley's gum from 1942 to 1945 because every stick went to military rations. The cigarettes were included despite some medical officers objecting. The reasoning was pragmatic. Soldiers smoked. Denying them cigarettes damaged morale. Including cigarettes in rations ensured even soldiers in the most remote locations received tobacco. During the war, the American military purchased and distributed 270 billion cigarettes. The health consequences were not considered. This was 1942. The connection between smoking and cancer wouldn't be definitively established for another decade. The packaging itself was an engineering marvel. Each K-ration box was made from waxed cardboard that resisted water and humidity. The inner components were wrapped in cellophane or foil or sealed in tins. A K-ration could be dropped from an aircraft, submerged briefly in water, or buried in mud and remain edible. Japanese rations, by contrast, were typically rice wrapped in paper or cloth. When these got wet, which happened constantly in the Pacific climate, the rice spoiled and became inedible. Now contrast this with what Japanese soldiers were eating, or more accurately, not eating. The official Japanese Army ration, established in the 1930s and barely modified during the war, consisted of 600 grams of rice, 200 grams of barley, 50 grams of meat or fish when available, pickled vegetables, and green tea. This provided roughly 2,000 calories when fully issued, adequate for garrison duty but insufficient for combat operations. However, the official ration was rarely fully issued. Japanese logistics prioritized ammunition and weapons over food. The Japanese military philosophy held that soldiers should endure hardship without complaint. Hunger built character and fighting spirit. This wasn't just propaganda, it was official doctrine. A well-fed soldier might become soft. A hungry soldier remained sharp and motivated. By 1942, as Japan's supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean that American submarines increasingly dominated, food shipments to forward units became sporadic. Soldiers on Guadalcanal, New Guinea, Burma, and dozens of Pacific islands began receiving half rations, then quarter rations, then nothing. Units were ordered to achieve local self-sufficiency. This meant foraging. Eat what you can find. Hunt, fish, gather plants. The problem was that most Japanese soldiers were urban conscripts with no survival skills. They didn't know which jungle plants were edible. They had no hunting experience. And the tropical islands they occupied often had limited food resources to begin with. What happened next was predictable and horrific. Japanese soldiers starved, not slowly over years, but rapidly over weeks and months. A healthy adult can survive roughly 30 to 40 days without food before organ failure begins. Soldiers engaged in combat operations, burning 4,000 calories daily while consuming 400, deteriorated faster. Within 2 weeks, muscle wasting became severe. Within a month, disease from malnutrition appeared. Dysentery, which caused diarrhea and prevented the body from absorbing what little nutrition existed. Beriberi, a thiamine deficiency causing nerve damage and heart failure. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C, pellagra from protein deficiency. These diseases killed Japanese soldiers more efficiently than American bullets. The diaries and letters recovered from dead Japanese soldiers tell a story of progressive horror. Early in deployments, the entries are optimistic. We will endure. The enemy is weak. Victory is certain. Within weeks, the tone changes. Food is scarce, but we manage. I am always hungry, but my spirit remains strong. By month 2 or 3, the entries become desperate. We have eaten all the vegetation near our position. Men are too weak to patrol. Disease is everywhere. I can no longer remember what full feels like. In the final entries, often written shortly before death, the tone is resigned. We are ordered to fight to the last man. This is not difficult. The last man will die of hunger before the enemy reaches us. Private Hideo Takahashi, serving with the 18th Army on New Guinea, kept a diary that was recovered by Australian forces. His final entries from late 1943 provide a window into the reality of Japanese military logistics. October 12th, we have received no supplies for 6 weeks. The rice is gone. We are eating grass soup. It provides no nutrition but fills the stomach temporarily. 3 men died today, not from wounds but from weakness. October 19th, we discovered a papaya tree. 12 men fought over the fruit. 2 were injured. We divided 6 papayas among 53 men. October 28th, I can no longer walk more than a few hundred meters before needing rest. My legs will not support me. We found an American supply dump yesterday. The enemy had destroyed most of it before retreating, but we recovered damaged cans of food. We ate food that was spoiled and caused many to become ill, but it was worth it for a full stomach. November 3rd, I am writing this knowing I will likely die soon, not from battle but from starvation. My body is consuming itself. I think constantly of food. I dream of meals my mother cooked, rice with fish, miso, soup. I would give anything for 1 bowl of rice. Takahashi died on November 7th, 1943. The Australian patrol that found his body noted he weighed approximately 90 pounds. He had been 5 foot 6 inches tall. A healthy man of that height should weigh around 140 pounds. Takahashi had lost over 1/3 of his body weight. This was not exceptional. This was normal for Japanese soldiers in the Pacific. Medical analysis of Japanese prisoners of war and recovered bodies consistently showed severe malnutrition. Average weight loss was 30 to 50 pounds. Many soldiers showed signs of having consumed non-food items. Leather from boots or belts often found partially digested in their stomachs. Grass and bark, which human digestive systems cannot process, in their intestines. In the most desperate cases, evidence emerged of cannibalism. Japanese soldiers consuming their own dead comrades. The Imperial Japanese Army acknowledged the problem, but treated it as a morale issue rather than a logistics failure. Soldiers were lectured about Yamato Damashe, the Japanese spirit, which would allow them to overcome material deprivation through willpower. Officers who reported that their men were starving were reprimanded for defeatism. When entire units collapsed from malnutrition and could not conduct operations, this was blamed on insufficient fighting spirit, not insufficient food. Meanwhile, American soldiers in the Pacific were eating K-rations and complaining they were boring. The most common complaint about K-rations was monotony. Eating the same combinations of food every day for weeks became psychologically wearing. Soldiers wrote letters home asking for food packages with variety, hot sauce, candy, cookies, not because they were hungry, but because they were bored with their food. The U.S. military took these complaints seriously. Recognizing that morale mattered, they developed the 10-in-1 ration, designed to feed 10 men and provide more variety. They shipped millions of pounds of supplementary food items, from candy bars to canned fruit to bread mixes to forward areas. In locations where logistics allowed, field kitchens were established serving hot meals. On ships, Navy cooks prepared fresh food daily. American forces in the Pacific ate better than many American civilians had during the Great Depression a decade earlier. The psychological impact of this disparity on Japanese soldiers who encountered American rations cannot be overstated. When Japanese forces overran American positions, the food they captured became more valuable than weapons or ammunition. Captured American supplies meant survival for another week, but they also meant a brutal revelation. Every K-ration, every C-ration can, every piece of chocolate or pack of cigarettes was physical proof that Japan was losing the war. Sergeant Mas Hiro served in the Philippines campaign. He was captured in 1945 and extensively interrogated. His testimony, recorded by American intelligence officers, provides remarkable insight. He spoke through a translator, and the interrogation transcript remains in the archives. "We knew we were losing when we understood how your soldiers ate. In 1942, we believed what we were told. America was weak, soft, dependent on luxury. Your soldiers needed comfort and could not endure hardship. We were the warriors. We could endure anything. When we captured American positions on Bataan and Corregidor, we found your supplies, mountains of food, canned meat, chocolate, coffee, cigarettes. We thought this was what you brought for an invasion force, your best supplies for a major operation. We thought when you were pushed back to Australia you would run out. You did not run out. More arrived. More and more and more. Endless supplies." Heroes continued. "In 1943, I was on New Guinea. We were starving, eating grass, eating anything. One day we ambushed an American patrol. We killed 3 men. We took their packs. Each pack had 4 K-rations, 12 meals per man. We divided these rations among 30 men. It was the best food we had eaten in months. This is when I understood. Your common soldiers, ordinary privates, carried more food for 3 days than we received in a week. And you had millions of these soldiers. We had courage, we had fighting spirit, we had willingness to die. You had food. Wars are not won by men willing to die. They are won by men who can keep fighting because they are fed. The German army faced a similar but less severe food crisis. German rations in 1941 and 1942 were adequate, approximately 2,500 calories daily with reasonable variety. Black bread, preserved meat, cheese, ersatz coffee, and occasional supplements. Not luxurious but sufficient. As the war progressed and German logistics deteriorated, rations declined in quality and quantity. By 1944, German soldiers were receiving approximately 2,000 calories daily, often less. By 1945, many units received under 1,500 calories, supplemented by whatever they could requisition from occupied territories or loot from abandoned positions. German soldiers who encountered American supplies had reactions similar to Japanese troops, but with an additional element of technical appreciation. Germans understood industrial production. They recognized quality manufacturing when they saw it. A captured German corporal, identified only as prisoner number 3847 in interrogation transcripts, described opening a K-ration. I could not believe this was a field ration for common soldiers. The packaging alone was superior to anything we had. Waterproof, durable, organized. The food inside was processed with precision. The meat was real meat. The chocolate was actual chocolate, not the ersatz substitutes we were eating. Most incredible was the waste. Cigarettes included as if they were essential. Chewing gum, which has no nutritional value, included just for comfort. This told me everything about American industrial capacity. They could afford to waste resources on luxuries for soldiers because their production was unlimited. We were rationing everything, making synthetic substitutes for coffee and meat and butter. The Americans were giving their soldiers the real thing and throwing in extras. The production statistics for American food supplies during the war are staggering. 105 million K-rations produced, 90 million C-rations produced, 60 million 10-in-1 rations produced, 5 billion pounds of canned and preserved meat, 2 billion pounds of cheese, 1 billion pounds of coffee, 500 million pounds of chocolate and candy, 40 billion cigarettes distributed annually. These numbers represented a mobilization of American agriculture and food processing industry on a scale never before attempted. And crucially, this was accomplished while American civilians ate better during the war than they had during the Depression. Let me give you specific examples of how this played out in actual combat situations. During the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943, U.S. Marines assaulted a heavily fortified Japanese position. The battle was brutal, with casualties on both sides. After securing the island, Marines found the Japanese garrison's food supplies. Rice in cloth sacks, most of it spoiled from humidity. Pickled vegetables in wooden barrels, rotting. Dried fish, inedible from mold. The Japanese defenders had been on reduced rations for weeks before the battle. They were weak from malnutrition, which contributed to the speed of their defeat despite fanatical resistance. Some Japanese soldiers were found dead not from combat wounds, but from starvation and disease. The Marines who took Tarawa were not eating gourmet food. They ate K-rations and C-rations. They drank water from canteens that tasted metallic and chlorinated. They wanted fresh vegetables and milk and steaks. But they were adequately fed, properly nourished, and maintained their physical strength. The Japanese defenders fought with the courage of desperate men, but desperation born of starvation is not the same as strength. A starving man can fight ferociously in his final moments, but he cannot sustain combat operations for days or weeks. The Americans could. That was the difference. On Saipan in June 1944, American forces again faced Japanese defenders who had been cut off from supply for months. When American soldiers secured Japanese positions, they found warehouses with military equipment but almost no food. Documents recovered indicated the garrison had been on quarter rations since March. By June, many Japanese soldiers were eating leaves and grass. The civilians on the island, Japanese settlers and native Chamorro people, were starving alongside the military. When American forces offered food to civilians who surrendered, many initially refused, believing it was poisoned. They could not comprehend that the enemy would feed them. When they finally ate and realized the food was safe, many broke down crying. They had been told Americans were monsters. Monsters don't give you chocolate and canned peaches. The most telling evidence of the food disparity came from Japanese prisoners of war. By 1944, despite cultural prohibitions against surrender, increasing numbers of Japanese soldiers were being captured, usually when too weak from starvation to resist or commit suicide. These prisoners were processed through POW camps where they received food according to Geneva Convention standards. The standard Allied POW ration was comparable to Allied military rations, approximately 3,000 calories daily, with adequate protein, vitamins, and minerals. Japanese prisoners gained an average of 30 to 40 pounds in their first 3 months of captivity. They were eating better as prisoners than they had as soldiers. American intelligence officers conducting interrogations noted that prisoners frequently became emotional when discussing food. Many initially refused to believe the POW rations were real, suspecting they were being fattened for some cruel purpose. When they realized the food would continue, that this was the standard, their worldview shattered. One prisoner, a lieutenant whose name was redacted in the files, gave testimony that was remarkable for its honesty. He had been captured on Peleliu in September 1944. After 2 months in captivity, he was interviewed. "I have been a prisoner for 62 days. I have eaten better in these 62 days than in the previous 18 months as a soldier, better than in the 2 years before that as a civilian in Japan. We were told America was starving, that your people were desperate, that you were weak from hunger. I eat 3 meals every day, real rice, not barley, meat at almost every meal, vegetables, fruit, bread. The guards eat the same food. Sometimes prisoners and guards eat in the same room. This would be impossible in Japan, where officers and enlisted eat separately, where guards would never eat with prisoners. Everything we were told was lies. You are not weak. You are not starving. You have so much food, you share it with enemies. How do we defeat a nation that feeds its prisoners better than we feed our soldiers? Let me tell you about the strategic implications of this food disparity, because it affected every aspect of Pacific combat operations. Japanese units could not conduct sustained operations. An attack might be fierce and determined for a few hours or a day, but Japanese forces lacked the physical stamina for week-long operations. American units could fight continuously for days or weeks because they remained physically strong. Recovery time after combat was vastly different. American wounded who received adequate nutrition healed faster and returned to duty sooner. Japanese wounded, already malnourished before injury, often died from wounds that should have been survivable because their bodies lacked resources to heal. Disease rates tell the story statistically. In American forces in the Pacific, disease caused approximately 1 hospitalization for every 3 combat casualties. This was considered high, reflecting the challenging tropical environment. In Japanese forces, disease caused an estimated 4 deaths for every combat death. Some historians estimate that 60% of Japanese military deaths in the Pacific were from disease and starvation rather than combat. 60%. More than half of Japan's war dead never died in battle. They died because their own logistics system failed to feed them. The most extreme example occurred in Burma, where the Japanese 15th Army conducted an offensive into India in 1944. The operation, called Yugo, involved 85,000 Japanese soldiers advancing through mountainous jungle terrain. The Japanese planned for the offensive to last 3 weeks, after which they expected to capture British supplies. They brought minimal rations, perhaps 2 weeks' worth for most units. The offensive stalled against British defenses. The Japanese were unable to capture the supply dumps they had counted on. After 3 weeks, soldiers began starving. After 5 weeks, the army was collapsing. Men were too weak to march. Equipment was abandoned. Wounded were left behind because healthy men lacked strength to carry them. The retreat from Burma became a nightmare. Of 85,000 men who began the offensive, approximately 53,000 died. British forces estimated they killed 15,000 Japanese soldiers in combat. The other 38,000 died from starvation, disease, and exhaustion. The road back to Burma was lined with bodies. British and Indian troops advancing behind the Japanese retreat reported finding Japanese corpses every few hundred meters. Some had died of wounds, but most showed no combat trauma. They had simply starched to death or died from dysentery and malaria in bodies too weak to fight infection. Japanese officers who survived the Burma retreat gave testimony after the war that described apocalyptic conditions. Major General Kato Kusato, commanding the 31st Division during the retreat, said in post-war interviews, "We did not retreat from the enemy. We retreated from hunger. My men were ghosts, walking skeletons who could barely carry their rifles. We had no food. We had no medicine. Men lay down beside the trail and did not rise. I walked past hundreds of my own men, dead or dying, and could do nothing. The enemy did not need to fight us. They only needed to wait for us to starve." Contrast this with American operations in the same theater. The Burma campaign for American forces involved sustained operations over months. Merrill's Marauders, the American long-range penetration unit, conducted operations deep behind Japanese lines from February to August 1944. They were supplied entirely by airdrops. C-47 transport aircraft flew daily missions dropping food, ammunition, and medical supplies. When Marauders became ill or wounded, they were evacuated by air. When they needed reinforcements, fresh troops were flown in. The Marauders faced brutal combat and challenging terrain, but they did not starve. They had malaria and dysentery like everyone fighting in Burma, but they had medicine to treat it and food to maintain strength despite illness. The final collapse of Japanese food logistics came in the Philippines in 1945. When American forces invaded Luzon, approximately 280,000 Japanese troops defended the island. By the time organized resistance ended in August 1945, approximately 210,000 Japanese soldiers had died. American combat losses accounted for perhaps 60,000 of those deaths. The remaining 150,000 Japanese soldiers died from starvation and disease. On the Bataan Peninsula, where Japanese forces had forced American and Filipino prisoners on the Bataan Death March in 1942, Japanese defenders in 1945 experienced their own death march. Not forced by an enemy, but by their own logistics failure. They had no food. They had no supply line. They ate bark, roots, leaves, and each other. American soldiers advancing through the Philippines reported finding Japanese positions where entire units had died not from combat but from hunger. Bodies lying in defensive positions with no wounds, rifles beside them unfired. They had simply waited until they were too weak to continue, then died. An American Army report from the Philippines campaign noted enemy resistance in many sectors collapsed not from our attacks, but from enemy inability to maintain physical capability for combat. Numerous positions were found abandoned, with evidence defenders were too malnourished to retreat. Bodies recovered showed extreme emaciation. This represents a complete failure of enemy logistics. Now I want to address something that's difficult but important. The food disparity led to documented cases of Japanese cannibalism in the Pacific. This is historical fact, recorded in testimony from both Japanese prisoners and Allied forces. The most documented cases occurred on New Guinea and in the Philippines. Starving Japanese soldiers, having exhausted all other food sources, consumed the dead. Initially their own dead comrades, in some cases executed prisoners, in rare but documented cases, local civilians. This was not a strategic decision or policy. It was the desperate final act of men driven mad by starvation. The Japanese government and military denied these incidents for decades after the war, but testimony from Japanese veterans and Allied investigations confirmed it occurred. This represents perhaps the darkest consequence of Japan's logistics failure. A military force that allows its soldiers to starve to the point of cannibalism has failed at the most fundamental level. The purpose of a military is to conduct organized violence in pursuit of strategic objectives. You cannot conduct organized violence if your soldiers are too hungry to stand. Let me bring this back to where we started. Private Takeshi Yamada finding an American K-ration in a foxhole on Guadalcanal. That moment, replicated thousands of times across the Pacific, represented a devastating psychological blow to Japanese forces. Every Japanese soldier who encountered American supplies understood immediately that they had been lied to. America was not weak. America was not collapsing. America was so powerful they could send chocolate to front-line troops. They could waste resources on chewing gum and cigarettes. They could afford luxuries for common soldiers that Japanese generals could not access. This understanding spread through Japanese ranks like poison. When soldiers know their cause is hopeless, when they understand defeat is inevitable, they continue fighting only from discipline and fear. Morale collapses. Combat effectiveness declines. The Japanese fought with suicidal determination in 1942 when they believed victory was possible. By 1944, they fought with suicidal desperation because death seemed preferable to continued suffering. That psychological shift from aggression toward victory to desperation toward death was influenced significantly by the understanding that they were starving while their enemies feasted. After the war, during the American occupation of Japan, many former Japanese soldiers worked for American occupation forces. They received American military rations as part of their compensation. The experience of eating K-rations and C-rations as employees after having encountered them as enemies produced complex emotions. Some felt humiliation at accepting food from conquerors. Others felt relief at finally having adequate nutrition. Many felt bitter anger at their own government and military for having sent them to war so inadequately supplied. One veteran, Hiroshi Funasaka, who wrote a memoir about his experiences in New Guinea, included this reflection. After the war, I ate American rations while working for the occupation forces. They gave me a K-ration for lunch. I opened it and saw the same chocolate bar I had found in 1943 in a captured position. In 1943, that chocolate bar was the most precious thing I had ever held. I savored it over 3 days, taking tiny bites. In 1947, I ate the chocolate bar in 2 minutes and threw away the packaging without thought. This is the difference between scarcity and abundance. In 1943, I believed scarcity made us strong. In 1947, I understood scarcity had made us weak. America won because they understood that hungry soldiers cannot fight, no matter how strong their spirit. The K-ration was officially discontinued after the war, replaced by improved rations based on lessons learned. But those small waxed cardboard boxes had served their purpose. They had fed American soldiers adequately, if not luxuriously. They had maintained American combat effectiveness across thousands of miles of jungle and ocean. And perhaps most significantly, they had demonstrated to Japan and to every other nation that challenged American power that the United States could project not just military force, but industrial abundance to the most remote corners of the globe. The story of American K-rations versus Japanese starvation is ultimately a story about two different approaches to warfare. Japan emphasized spirit over material, courage over logistics, willingness to endure suffering over necessity to prevent it. This philosophy produced soldiers of extraordinary bravery and determination, but it also produced an army that literally starved to death while occupying resource-rich territories. America emphasized material over spirit, logistics over courage, elimination of suffering as a force multiplier. This philosophy produced soldiers who complained about their boring rations while eating more food daily than enemy soldiers saw in a week. Which approach won? History answered that question decisively. The Japanese fought with courage that impressed even their enemies. But courage without calories becomes weakness. Spirit without sustenance becomes desperation. And determination without food becomes a slow march to starvation. The K-ration represented American industrial capacity, logistical sophistication, and philosophical commitment to keeping soldiers supplied. These factors won the Pacific War as surely as any battle or bomb. Private Takeshi Yamada died on Guadalcanal in February 1943. According to the American patrol that found his body, he weighed approximately 95 pounds and showed evidence of severe malnutrition. His diary was recovered and eventually returned to his family after the war. His final entry, dated 3 days before his death, read simply, "I cannot remember what full feels like. I cannot remember Japan. I can only remember hunger. If there is an afterlife, I hope there is food." This is the reality of Japanese logistics in the Pacific War. While American soldiers complained their chocolate bars tasted waxy, Japanese soldiers were dying of starvation, with Yamada's final words echoing from thousands of forgotten positions across the Pacific. "I cannot remember what full feels like." The contrast between American abundance and Japanese deprivation was not just a matter of industrial capacity, though that certainly mattered. It was a matter of philosophy, of how each nation valued its soldiers' lives. America treated soldier welfare as a military necessity. Japan treated soldier suffering as a military virtue. Both approaches claimed to maximize combat effectiveness. Only one actually worked. So here's what the K-ration really represent. Not just food, but the fundamental difference between America and its enemies. Not just nutrition, but philosophy. Not just logistics, but values. The Japanese soldier finding an American ration wasn't just discovering food. He was discovering that everything his military had told him was wrong. And in that discovery lay the seeds of inevitable defeat. Because you cannot defeat a nation that treats chocolate and cigarettes for its soldiers as standard equipment, while your own soldiers are eating grass. That's the untold story of the Pacific War. Not the dramatic battles or heroic last stands, but the quiet starvation in jungle foxholes while America shipped ice cream to forward bases. Not the banzai charges or kamikaze attacks, but the slow realization among Japanese soldiers that they were fighting an enemy so powerful that feeding its armies adequately was barely an afterthought. The K-ration won the war as surely as any battleship or bomber. It just did it one meal, one chocolate bar, one cigarette at a time, until every Japanese soldier who survived long enough understood the truth. They couldn't win, they never could, because America could do what Japan could not, feed its soldiers, and that simple fact decided everything. If you've just discovered how food won the Pacific War, how American logistics crushed Japanese spirit, how a chocolate bar represented inevitable defeat, then subscribe to War Rewind for daily deep dives into the untold stories of World War II. Hit that like button if this changed how you see the war. And tell me in the comments what shocked you most: the starvation, the cannibalism, the K-ration luxuries, or the fact that Japan sent soldiers to die hungry while calling it Bushido. Tomorrow will reveal another story the history books buried. Until then, remember that wars aren't just won by heroes. They're won by logistics, and the side with the chocolate usually wins.